The Roman province of Britannia would be one of the last territories conquered by the Romans back in the 1st century AD, during the reign of Claudius. It was conquered mainly to win Claudius' fame and prestige, as it was incredibly far from the Mediterranean core of the empire, and prior to Julius Caesar's invasion of the island a few decades prior, most Romans believed the island to be a land of myth, a land of unending rain and strange, painted natives. The province would also be the first to be fully abandoned by the Romans, as in 410 AD the Western Emperor Honorius abandoned all hope of retaking the island, prioritizing dealing with civil wars and barbarian invasions, as the city of Rome itself would be sacked the same year by the Goths led by Alaric. But what if that changed? What if the Romans held on to Britannia through the chaos of the 5th century? What would be the fate of the island and the world if even after the fall of Rome in 476 the legions remained in Britannia, and the Roman Empire lived on in the island of Britannia? This is the question I will answer in today's video. Remember to like and subscribe. First, some context, and a brief overview of the history of Roman Britain. The Romans would first land on the shores of Britain in 55 BC, when Julius Caesar landed on the island to stop the southern tribes from lending aid to their Gallic allies on the mainland. The Romans would not stay in Britain, however, and it would take nearly another century before the island was brought under full Roman rule under the reign of Claudius in the year 43 AD. It would not be long, however, until trouble arose in the new province, as only 15 years after the conquest a massive native revolt would break out in the province, being led by the warrior Queen Boudica. However, despite some initial success and a massive numerical advantage, the rebels would be crushed by Roman forces, and the cities and forts of Britannia would be repaired. Roman Britain would always be an unstable province. During the 3 centuries of Roman rule, it would face invasions from the Picts in the north, even despite Hadrian's Wall looming across the border. Britannia would also face Irish raids on its western shore, and eventually Anglo-Saxon raids from Germany on its eastern shore. This would lead to the province being heavily stationed with legions, and with legions come ambitious generals. This legionary presence in Britannia, along with the increased urbanization in Roman cities like Londinium or Eboracum, would Romanize a large amount of local Celts, creating a Romano-British culture. Even the rural populations would adopt aspects of Roman culture, like religion for example. In the early years, Roman deities would be worshipped alongside Celtic ones, and eventually in the 4th century, the near full adoption of Christianity across the island would bring a new level of Romanization to the culture, right at the end of Roman rule. Despite the efforts of the Romans, Britain would never become as Romanized as a province like Gaul, for example. This is one of the reasons Britain would be such a troublesome and rebellious province, with Britannia fully breaking away from the empire at least 3 times before it was fully abandoned in 410, with Britannia being a part of the secessionist Gallic Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century, the island falling to the Great Barbarian Conspiracy of 367, for example, and with multiple generals starting large rebellions by taking the Britannic legions to the mainland to fight civil wars, with some famous examples like Constantine the Great in 306, Magnus Maximus in the 380s, and finally a general in 407 AD who styled himself Constantine III, who would take all the legions from the island to the province of Gaul to ally with invading barbarians in a civil war against the Emperor Honorius, which would leave the island undefended and lead to Britannia being abandoned just 3 years later. But what if Constantine III kept the legions in Britannia, and the Roman presence on the island remained strong even after the fall of the West? This is where we're going to start the scenario in 407 AD with Constantine III. In our timeline, he used the chaos of a barbarian invasion of Gaul to declare himself emperor and start a civil war against Honorius, which he would ultimately lose. In this timeline, he still rebels against the reign of Emperor Honorius, but instead of invading Gaul, he consolidates his power in Britannia and uses the chaos of the invasion in Gaul to stop paying taxes to the emperor in Ravenna, and he uses these funds to strengthen his position in Britannia by raising new legions and hiring Germanic mercenaries. This military buildup on the island would deter the Picts, Irish, and Anglo-Saxons from falling upon the province like what happened in our timeline after the legions were evacuated. Like in our timeline, however, I do not think that Honorius would do anything about this, as he was an ineffective ruler who was preoccupied with Germanic invasions in Gaul, and especially after the sack of Rome in 410, Honorius would be preoccupied with the Gothic threat in Italy and Hispania. So just like in our timeline, he would abandon the island, but not to the fate of the barbarians, but to the rule of local military presence, now led by Emperor Constantine III and his generals. After the death of Honorius in 43 AD, I think the island would remain an independent empire, as it would still have to deal with Anglo-Saxon and Irish raids. Although as time would go on, the situation in Britannia would be seen as better than the situation in neighboring Gaul, which would have to deal with permanent barbarian settlements and continuous invasions from other Germanic tribes, leading to a reversal of what happened in our timeline, where Romano-Britons fled to Gaul. In this timeline, Romans and Gaul would flee to relatively more stable Britannia. However, Britannia would not be peaceful by any means. It is still likely that the Anglo-Saxon raids would increase in size and strength as time would go on, but the strength of the Romano-Britons would be far greater in this timeline, so they would be able to stop these invasions far more effectively than the 5th century Britons of our timeline. Despite having domestic issues to deal with, I think that the Romano-Britons would still maintain relations with powers in neighboring Gaul, and would likely send soldiers to aid General Aetius in his fight against Attila the Hun, as in our timeline, Aetius's coalition was incredibly diverse, with Romans, Goths, Franks, and more, so I don't think it's a stretch that Britannia would send some troops to help fight off the Huns. This would also help repair relations with the central Roman authorities. However, the Romano-Britons would not be able to commit a large amount of troops, as they would be simultaneously dealing with Anglo-Saxon raids along their east coast, which would take priority. These improved relations with the mainland Western Empire would come to a peak a few years later during the reign of Majorian, who, like the elite in the Britannic Empire, would dream of restoring the glory of Rome, and thus, like Aetius, the Britannic Empire would send aid to Majorian in his wars in Gaul against the Goths and Burgundians. In exchange for this military aid against the barbarians in Gaul, Majorian would recognize Constans II, the son of the late Constantine III, as a legitimate co-emperor ruling over the province of Britannia. However, Majorian would still be betrayed and assassinated in this timeline, just like in our own. But in this timeline, Majorian's general Aegidius, who established his own Roman client state in northern Gaul after the fall of Majorian, would now have a strong ally just across the Channel in Britannia. As the Western Empire continues to diminish through the 460s and 470s, Aegidius's realm in northern Gaul would continue to form close ties with the Roman state in Britannia, as it was surrounded by barbarians in the rest of Gaul, and the authority of the Western Empire was solely confined to Italy by this point, so the only state that could reliably aid the realm of Soissons would be the Empire of Britannia. Rome would still fall in 476 AD, with the Germanic general Odoacer overthrowing the last Western emperor, the teenage Romulus Augustulus, and Odoacer would still send the western imperial regalia to the eastern emperor Zeno, as Odoacer would still wish to rule Italy as his own kingdom. But in this timeline, this would be opposed by the Emperor of Britannia, who would claim that since he had been recognized as a legitimate emperor by the late Majorian, and now that he was the only legitimate imperial authority left in the West, he would declare himself the Western Roman Emperor in 476, and receive the recognition from his allies in the realm of Soissons, led by the son of Aegidius, the general Syagrius. However, he would not receive recognition from Zeno, who would favor allowing Odoacer to rule Italy in his name, and whom he could use against the Ostrogoths in the Balkans. This new Western Roman Empire would consist only of the province of Britannia and part of northern Gaul, as it would still be a relatively weak state at this time, defending against constant Anglo-Saxon and Irish raids, as well as Pictish invasions in the north, and now having to defend the disconnected realm of Soissons from the Franks and Goths across the Channel in mainland Gaul. This would prove to be too much for these last Western Romans, as they would still lose the realm of Soissons to the Franks sometime in the 490s. However, in this scenario, the Roman soldiers and civilians of Soissons would be able to flee across the Channel to Britannia. Thus, in the long run, this would strengthen the empire, condensing the soldiers and providing a population boost to the cities of southern Britannia, especially Londinium, which would now find itself the capital of the Western Roman Empire. And in this timeline, with the Romans still around to defend and maintain them, the cities wouldn't fall into ruin like they did in our timeline, and Roman culture would continue to flourish in the urbanized south. And with the increased presence of Roman soldiers and civilians from the mainland, this Romanized belt in Britannia would only continue to expand, with local Celtic population being thankful for Roman rule, defending them from the pagan barbarians. Also, Christianity would continue to flourish in Britannia, unlike in our timeline, when the Anglo-Saxons snuffed it out in large parts of England, until their eventual conversion centuries later. In this timeline, Christianity would be a Romanizing force across the island, with nearly all of the island's population being Christian, even in largely Celtic-dominated rural areas of the north and west. This would also lead to an even sooner adoption of the religion by the Scots and Irish, likely becoming Christian very soon after the fall of Rome, which would prove to be a great aid to the relations between the Romans and these peoples going into the future. The Roman state in Britain would likely be able to stabilize sometime in the mid-6th century once the Anglo-Saxon raids slowed down, and the Irish raids stopped due to Christianization and improved relations. The Roman state would be far more centralized than the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of our timeline, and thus once the raids stopped, the Romans could focus on reconquering parts of Gaul from the Franks in the 600s. The Romans would be able to capitalize on Frankish succession crises and seize the Breton Peninsula, which they would be able to reinforce and keep, just like the local Bretons did in our own timeline. The Romans would be able to maintain peaceful relations with the Scottish across from Hadrian's Wall, as they would have more interest in conquering land in France than uniting the islands of Great Britain. Despite this, wars would still occur with the Scottish and Irish, as the Romans would likely demand tribute from these states, as they would have a stronger military presence over these Celtic nations. But these wars would likely be short and small, as the Romans would have no interest in conquering these lands, only in maintaining influence and receiving tribute payments. This would not be the case in Francia, as the Romans would dream of reconquering the old province of Gaul from the Franks. The Romans would likely not be strong enough, however, to project power deep into Gaul when the Franks were united, but when they were fractured, the Romans could likely seize coastal lands and make forts along the Channel, and would maintain a large force in Brittany. This would be a stable back and forth until the centralization of the Franks under Pepin the Short and especially under Charlemagne, as the Franks would conquer a large empire and establish a very close relationship with the papacy. This Frankish centralization would be occurring at the same time as the first Viking raids would land on the island, forcing the Romans to pull back from many of their forward mainland bases in Gaul and focus on the defense of Britannia. The Romans would struggle against the Vikings, just like the Anglo-Saxons, but would be in a much better position than the disunited Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of our timeline. The initial raids would still catch the Romans off guard, as it had been centuries since the Anglo-Saxon raids of the 5th and 6th centuries. The Vikings would also be even more interested in the island in this timeline, as the island would be far wealthier than in our timeline. This could lead to a larger amount of Viking invasion of Britannia. These invasions would definitely catch the Romans off guard, but after pulling reinforcements from the south and the forts in Gaul, the Romans would be able to confine the Vikings in the north between the sea and Hadrian's Wall. It would still take decades of bloody wars to push the Vikings out, but it would be much less bloody, and the Vikings would not conquer as much of the island as they did in our own timeline. However, Viking raids would still remain a constant threat to Britannia for centuries, and combined with the logistical needs of supplying their bases in Gaul across the Channel, this would finally force the Romans to invest more into their navy, likely adopting the longboats that the Viking used, just like the ancient Romans adopted the ships of the Carthaginians. The other major event of the 9th century would be the Pope's coronation of Charlemagne as Roman Emperor in 800 AD, which would cause outrage in Britannia, as they had long claimed that their leader was the rightful Western Emperor due to the recognition of Constans II by Majorian nearly 4 centuries before, and that after the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476, that their state was the legitimate Western Roman Empire. However, the Romans would have little ability to challenge this due to Viking raids, but luckily the Franks would also be affected by Viking raids. So the confrontation between the Romans and the Franks would have to wait until both nations dealt with the Viking threat. However, by the 10th century, the Viking threat would be largely dealt with in both nations, with their expulsion from Britannia and the establishment of the Duchy of Normandy in Francia as a buffer between other Vikings and the Romans across the Channel, and in Brittany. The rivalry between the Romans in Britain and the Franks would remain strong, with the Romans now having to deal with the Normans in what used to be their forts in northern Gaul. The Romans, with their new strong navy, however, would likely be able to overwhelm the fledgling Norman duchy and re-establish their forts in northern Gaul, and as the Frankish kings would continue to lose authority in their lands to local lords, the Romans would be able to advance across northern Gaul by the end of the 10th century by bribing local lords and using their large navy to threaten coastal possessions. Over the course of a century, the Romans would finally be able to consolidate control over all of Gaul by the middle of the 11th century. How would this resurgent Western Empire affect the development of Europe and the world in coming centuries? Would the Church split in three instead of two? Would the West Romans try to conquer Italy and Spain next? Would the West try to establish relations with the East again? And could this resurgent empire survive to the modern age, or would the Romans be pushed back to Britain and eventually fade to history? These questions and more will be left to you, as after the reconquest of Gaul is where I will end this scenario. Remember to like and subscribe, and don't forget to comment if you want a part 2, where we explore the Western Roman Empire in the Middle Ages and colonial period. Thanks again, and have a good one.